We are live. Correct.
And we're live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Can you share your screen again? I think. Can you share your screen again?
Oh, share my screen again. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. If we're live.
Share your screen again.
Let's see. There we go. Pleased to see everybody again. Sorry for the little technical hiccup there. If we were indeed live while it happened, I was assuming we were. But a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Greg Guglielmo. I'm the founder of Avanti Prep, MBA Admissions Consulting. We're here today to discuss interviews, MBA interviews. Interview season, at least round one interview season, is upon us. Our focus today is going to be on a few things. How to ace your MBA interview. So we will look at MBA interviews kind of writ large. What do they look like? What do they feel like? What are the core questions, the common questions that exist within them? We'll deconstruct those interviews. I know it can be a little bit intimidating, especially if it's your first time going through this process, which oftentimes it is, a one and done. You go through the process once. It's not like you gain year over year expertise in it. So it can feel a little daunting, a little intimidating. Where do I start? How do I think about these questions? How do I categorize them? We'll go through some of that. And what we'll end up looking at are different types of questions that exist within the common MBA interview. That includes core questions. I call them the core five. It includes behavioral questions. Those are questions that basically start with, tell me about a time when, or share an example of. And we'll go through self-awareness questions, what I call self-awareness questions. We will also, as promised, focus specifically on Kellogg and Berkeley Haas. They both have, I would say, interviews that fit, for the most part, the common patterns of MBA interviews. It's not the Harvard interview, which is very, very unique. It's not the, Virginia Darden has a pretty unique interview. I would say that, while every school's interview is ultimately, if you analyze them specifically enough and granularly enough, you'll see that they are a little bit different, and you can pick up on patterns. We'll talk about some of that today. They still are, the Haas interview and the Kellogg interview are both enough part of the mainstream that what we talk about for one is going to be beneficial for the other. And really what we talk about today is going to be beneficial for most MBA interviews across the board. So my name again, Greg Guglielmo. I'm the founder of Avanti Prep, MBA Admissions Consulting. We work with clients from all around the world on all, parts and processes related to applications, and that includes, of course, interviews. We do have, if I may take a quick moment, we do have an interview prep service. It's 3 hours in duration if you sign up for the interview prep service. We do pride ourselves on it being extremely thorough and comprehensive. I think if you poked around the marketplace, you'd probably see that a lot of interview prep services are 1 hour total. It might be 30 minutes of mock interview and 30 minutes of feedback, or maybe 45-minute mock interview, 45 minutes of feedback. We go for 3 hours. That's 1 hour, usually a 1 hour mock interview, which is actually longer than most real interviews. That's intentional to get more practice, to cover more ground together while you're prepping. And then 2 hours of feedback, really question by question feedback. That's the default style. Some people like to slice up the 3 hours a little bit differently, but we do the extended mock interview in the style of each school, question by question, coaching, feedback, and strategy, going very granularly through how you responded to specific questions, how you structured your answer, what points you hit. Pretty deep, as deep of a dive as you could probably imagine. It is usually, we often, not always, but often divide that first hour and second 2 hours into 2 sessions. A lot of times that's back-to-back days. If you do schedule, it's avantiprep.com, avantiprep.com. Please do allow enough time to schedule your sessions. So I think sometimes people receive invitation to interview, they very eagerly and enthusiastically go and book. They get the interview invite on like a Friday. They book the interview for the following Wednesday. That probably wouldn't be enough time for us to schedule and work together. That's something we would want to do in advance. So if you do get invited to interview and you would like to work together, please try to schedule the interview. It doesn't have to be as far out as possible, but with some lead time so that we can schedule what is this pretty thorough kind of thing. If you have interview essays, you can add hourly services to your interview prep to work with us on those or to brainstorm those. Some schools do have additional essays or an additional video if it's booth, for example. If you want to talk strategy on that, you can accompany your core interview prep service with additional hourly services. Still, other people like to sign up for hourly services in advance of this service to just talk through interview, like how to almost like a personalized version of what we're going to do today. How should I approach these questions? How should I construct my answers? How should I think through things? So any and all of the above. We've got a coupon code there for you, which you can use at checkout on the website. Again, avantiprep.com. You save 5% with the coupon code listed on the screen. We'll share that again toward the end. All right, enough of the marketing stuff, I guess you could call it. We obviously would be happy to work with you. I do think it's extremely effective, but let's get to the point of what we're here to cover today. So again, I mentioned we're going to cover most of what we cover will be relevant for most types of traditional, call them mainstream MBA interviews. There are a few exceptions to that. I mentioned Harvard being probably the most noteworthy exception, Darden being something of an exception to it. In terms, it's kind of this open-ended conversation driven by just a small handful of questions. Maybe there are a couple of other exceptions out there, but for the most part, Berkeley, Haas, and Kellogg fit in the common pattern of MBA interviews in terms of style, in terms of the type of questions they ask, and so forth. So what we talk about today will be relevant for many, many schools. We'll key in on Haas and Kellogg as well. Just a little bit of background on both of these schools' interviews and interview processes. Berkeley Haas's interviews are by invitation only. So those of you out there who, assuming if you're joining this call now, probably you applied in round one. Interviews are by invitation only at Haas. They utilize student or alumni interviewers. You'll occasionally run into this. Started like a year or two ago, I think. Haas using a pre-recorded video format to kind of help meet interview demand, I guess you could say. It at least last year was 5 questions via pre-record through the Kira, K-I-R-A video platform. I believe you had 45 seconds to prepare for each. You'd receive the question, have 45 seconds to think, and then I think it was 3 minutes. Don't quote me on exactly that duration, but I believe it was 3 minutes then to respond. But the traditional interviews, the traditional person-to-person, or these days virtual, still virtual interviews, would be with a student or an alum for Haas. People tend to say roughly that their interview, people we speak with, people we work with observationally, I would say that the Haas interview runs for about 30 to 60 minutes. I think some of the, and that, that's from when you sit down, they're questioning you, there's time for you to ask questions at the end. Pretty wide range, admittedly. I think some of the variance has to do with, just like anything else, who you get as your interviewer, what time of day it is, where it fits into somebody's schedule. If you're interviewing with a student and they're, have to run to class, at like the top of the hour or something, there's probably less of a likelihood that the interview is going to run long. They'll probably keep it within the allotted time box. They're not going to rush you, but it'll probably stay within the time box. I think sometimes with like alums, I'll use that example. I will say during a non-COVID period, if you were interviewing with an alum in your local city at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning or after work for you and for them, those are the ones I often see go a little bit longer. Maybe you get a student who's done with their with their school day. This isn't Haas specific, by the way. This is just in general regarding duration of MBA interviews. Those are the ones that I think could go a little bit longer, because it just turns into an open-ended conversation. I think that can be a good thing for you as the interviewee. Don't cut if you happen to be interviewing on a Saturday or something, you got to be cognizant and respectful of the interviewer's time. You could even ask that question during the Q&A at the end. Is it how are we okay on time? I want to be respectful of your time. But if they're enjoying talking about their experience as a student, as an alum, let that conversation flow organically and let it be. But anyway, that's a long tangent related to timing of interviews. Same thing basically with Kellogg. I mean, people quote them as being a little bit shorter. This is based off of input that we hear from applicants. I think, if anything, on the Kellogg side, they also use AdCom members. So you could be students, alums, or AdCom members. All these, by the way, are given equal weight. So don't worry, don't stress about with whom you're interviewing. But the fact that there are AdCom members included in the Kellogg group, it could keep it a little bit tighter, because there's less of that propensity to have that open-ended, Saturday or late in the day conversation that I was just describing. Big difference with Kellogg is that they interview most applicants. That's kind of something Kellogg's been famous for, I guess you could say, decades now, interviewing close to all. I think in recent years, we've seen a few more interview waivers. I know that in certain pre-COVID, in certain markets, where they were still trying to do, person to person, literally not just person to person on video, but person to person in the flesh. We saw some interview waivers in high demand markets, still seeing some interview waivers as well. You can only control what you can control, but Kellogg does interview most applicants. That's a difference between Haas and Kellogg. Haas, like many schools, interview by invitation only. Kellogg interviews most applicants with some possibility of waivers. Both schools run what's called blind interviews. That means the interviewer has only seen your resume. Kind of maybe not an intuitive word, blind. Maybe think, okay, they haven't seen anything. It speaks to blind to your application. The interviewer in these cases will have only seen your resume. So that means, hey, look, what you wrote about, the stories that you shared in your application, those are totally fair game. You don't need to worry that you're like repeating stories from your application. In fact, if they are the stories that became your essays and were strong enough and interesting enough and telling enough and revealing enough for them to have made it into your application and made it into your essays, they probably should be top of mind for an interview as well. But just so you know, blind for both of these, the interviewer has only seen your resume. That's a little bit of background. Apologies for the tangents on Haas and Kellogg interviews. What we're going to cover or continue to cover here today, a few different categories of things, how to kind of research and reflect going into the interview, core questions, self-awareness questions. These are all my own titles for these, but the core 5 questions, self-awareness questions, and behavioral questions. And they're noted at the bottom. I'm not sure if that's too hard to read, but please do familiarize yourself with the exact format and question patterns for all programs with which you're interviewing, because they do vary. Some vary greatly. I mentioned a few examples earlier. Others vary just a little bit, and you're looking for nuances and question frequencies and things like that during your preparation. If I look to the side here, I've got 2 screens. I've got the presentation over on one, so apologies for that. So first thing, research and reflect. Research the school, its interview format, and its interview reports to try to identify the aforementioned patterns that are specific to each school. Where do you do that? GMAT Club is one of the first resources that come to mind for me. GMAT Club has an interview debrief page. Let's see if I can pull that up for you here. Just so you're familiar with it. If you're joining this call and you're immersed in GMAT Club, you might already be familiar. So apologies if this is redundant. Where am I going? And there we go. Let's see if that pops up. There we go. Little delay. So GMAT Club interview debriefs. The URL is there at the top of the page. Perhaps the admins can share that along the bottom of the YouTube stream here. Honestly, I usually Google GMAT Club interview debriefs. It'll be the first thing that pops up. The important thing here is, it's technically it's under their decision tracker section of the website. You can see some of the tabs there. Top real-time update, summary by school, interview debriefs. The important thing, of course, when you're on the interview debriefs page is to find the correct school. There we go. There's the link. Thank you. Filter for, in this case, let's say Kellogg. And the interviews that come up. So what are these? These are real interviews from people who, somewhat recently, if some of these have already happened, you can see this person reporting that it lasted approximately an hour. So that was a little longer than the 30 to 45 minutes that I mentioned earlier. But the point of this is a first step in a research process for you to familiarize yourself with specific questions, question patterns, question types, question frequencies at a school-specific level. I usually encourage applicants to pull up, there's GMAT Club, there are other resources out there too. You don't have to look at a million different interviews. I think the more recent ones are going to be more beneficial. But you can familiarize yourself with what these questions, question patterns, question types are. I even say, hey, look, if you got a couple of screens or, open up a couple of documents, make a document for yourself and start to see, you could almost even assign percentages. You'll start to see certain questions. Hey, that seems to come up in every interview. Why? I mean, you could do this, know this without research. You're going to get a question like why MBA, why Kellogg in essentially any of these. Always be prepared for that. But you could actually put a number. So you look at, 12 different Kellogg interviews and see that question came up in all 12. There might be other questions that you see came up, in 8 out of 12 interviews or 6 out of 12 interviews. You'll see some of that variance, for example, with the behavioral questions. Some seem more likely than others. We're going to dive into this in more specificity in a little bit. Some seem more likely than others less likely. So you can kind of build out that document for yourself. Another valuable reason to do that is because as you build out that document, your brain is sort of going through a thought process, even if it's subconscious. How would I answer this question? You're starting almost to think about in your own head what your potential approaches or responses or what topics you'd cover might be. In building out that document, I often encourage people to think about some of the categories that we're going to discuss today. The core questions: walk me through your resume or tell me about yourself. What are your goals? What are your short and long-term career goals? Why MBA or why MBA? Why now? Why Kellogg or why Haas or why XYZ school? And what could you uniquely contribute to Haas or to Kellogg or to whatever school? And again, you'll see exactly those. If we look just at this example, I'm not sure if that's too hard to read. Apologies if it is, but exactly some of those questions. Walk me through your resume is the first one listed here. And then a little later in the interview, in this case, what are your short and long-term career goals? Why MBA? Why Kellogg? There were 4 of the 5 core questions asked there. But we'll talk about that contributions question because I think that can be valuable even if not asked. Let's think about a way to express ways you can uniquely contribute to a given school during your interview. Let's take it back to the presentation. So that's the first bullet point up there on the page. Research the school, its interview format and interview reports to identify patterns and question frequencies, and for you to begin to think about and categorize in your head, what am I going to walk into? What do I think I'm going to walk into? The goal, by the way, is not for you to kind of robotically, like script answers. It's just to familiarize yourself with what you're probably going to be walking into and start to strategize around, well, which example would I reach for? If I'm asked about a time I worked in a diverse team, or a time I stepped into a leadership role, or a time I questioned the status quo, where would I reach? We're going to talk in a few minutes about building a mental bench of examples. If they ask me about my strengths or my weaknesses or what my colleagues would say about me, what adjectives would I reach for there? How would I explain those? You're not scripting these so much as thinking through, and it's almost more, you could say, talking points or ideas that you then verbalize in as natural a way as possible, in an authentic way during the interview. The goal is not to script things. I have another bullet point up there, the second one highlighted in blue at the top of the page. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I say, inhale the propaganda of the school. That means all of the resources, videos. If you have an interview coming up in 10 days and maybe you don't have any other apps you're working on because round one is behind you, you have 10 days now ahead of that interview to just, again, I'll say it with with kind of a wink, but inhale the propaganda of the school. Read the blogs, watch the videos, understand the values, read the mission statement, get to know what that school stands for. You should have ideally, even before you've applied, attended events, spoken with current students and or alumni. If you haven't done that, now that's a great time to do it before you interview. If you have done it, maybe you revisit one or two of those conversations. Some of those conversations, by the way, or some of those events can be woven in verbally into your interview. You can mention, you can mention having, you don't have to do this a million times or force it in there, but you can naturally, and where appropriate and where natural, mention having spoken to so-and-so, the current co-president of the Women in Business Club, or having spoken with so-and-so, the current VP of External Affairs for the Tech Club. I was excited to learn about, there are ways, in a why Haas or in a why Kellogg answer, those might be natural places for those to get woven in, or if you visited campus or attended a certain event. So research the interviews, research the schools. You're going to want to have a very deep familiarity with the type of interviews you're walking into, as well as with the program, what it stands for, its resources, and its culture and community and values. A couple other things. We don't have to spend a ton of time on this page here. We could get into the meat of things, but people a lot of times think about and stress about the content of their answers. Definitely important. It is part of what's being evaluated in interviews. You're being evaluated on, how clear are your goals? How are they achievable? Are they rational? Are they, what's your understanding of the school and perhaps how you can contribute? There is all of that, but you're also being evaluated on your interpersonal skills, your professionalism, your presence, your poise. So, don't look past those things. You want to be clear, you want to be consistent, you want to be confident, you want to be credible. So just a few additional notes there. Dress. This is interesting. I feel like this has come up more and more in the last couple of years. I don't know if it's because of the work from home thing or the ever increasing casualization of professional society. But business attire is the default, like suit, tie, jacket, I guess for male applicants out there. But business attire, I consider it, the default is basically business formal. Doesn't mean a tuxedo, but a suit, tie, jacket, not no tie, not the only time I would do that. The only time I personally would pivot off of business attire is if the interview instructions explicitly allowed it. If there was a bullet point in the email from the school that said business casual is acceptable or something like that. But I feel like that question has, I'm just going to say ironically, maybe not so ironically, given some of the trends of dress, in the marketplace. But this is a business interview. You want to be yourself and you want your personality to come across. But, it's a professional interview. So, look the part, act the part. That doesn't mean to button yourself up. Just because you're wearing that guard doesn't mean to button yourself up to the point that your personality is not coming across and you're building rapport and, smiling if appropriate, where appropriate, or just whatever you naturally do. But it is a professional interview there as well. Video things, check the connection, check your lighting, your positioning, your sound. I'm probably violating some of these things right now, but I oftentimes tell people, try to put whatever you look at. Are you looking at yourself? Are you looking at the person you're interviewing with? If your camera is at the top of your screen, put whatever you're looking at right below the camera or as close to the camera as possible to create the sensation of eye contact. It's a little bit weird in the video era, the video conferencing era, but just make sure, try to create a sensation of eye contact. You wouldn't want whatever you're looking at, you wouldn't want it to be in the bottom. If I moved this screen down here, well, I'm still looking at the screen, but obviously it looks weird. If I were interviewing, I'd want to create the sensation as much as possible of eye contact. Check your connection, check your lighting. I got a bullet point on there that probably sounds weird in the COVID era, but hey, if you're in a city like New York or Chicago or San Francisco and you work a couple of blocks from your interviewer and you're meeting at a coffee shop or a public location and it's not a huge inconvenience, I'd scout the location in advance. Like, what are you walking into? What's the seating like? Are there big lines there? If there are big lines while you wait to get coffee or tea or whatever you're getting for the interview, you're going to have a conversation with the interviewer while you wait on the line. So, it's just a kind of a human and subconscious thing as well. I think that if you've been to a location before, there's a certain psychological comfort. I guess if you're interviewing, again, this is maybe irrelevant because no one's going to be interviewing, a few people are going to be interviewing in person. If you're interviewing at a hotel conference center and it's not far from where you work, check it out, get the lay of the land, look around. I mean, there's like that kind of human comfort and confidence that comes when you've been places beforehand. Have photo ID handy, by the way, even for videos, just as an aside. We've seen that come up a little bit. You say, oh, hey, they asked me for my photo ID to hold it up to the camera just to confirm that it's me. And people say, oh, it was a video interview, I didn't have it on me, or it was in the other room. Have your photo ID ready. We'll talk a little bit about questions for the end. There's some other bullet points on there. You should plan to have some interesting questions at the end of the interview from a pattern standpoint, from a flow standpoint. MBA interviews, they're going to start with some small talk. Maybe it's on that coffee or tea line in a non-COVID situation, but even on video, there's probably going to be some pleasantries exchanged in the beginning. They might give them, a little bit of background about themselves, 1 or 2 sentences about who they are, and then probably turn it over to you. Tell me now. Love for you if you could go ahead and tell me about yourself, or why don't you walk me through your resume? The baton gets passed to you to answer those questions. For the next 30 to 40 minutes, or however long it goes, the interviewer will be driving the bus. A lot of people say these interviews are conversational. That's true, I think, in the sense of tone, but I think it can sometimes be misinterpreted. Conversational means they're not there. These interviewers are not there to like scare you or intimidate you. They want you to be comfortable. They want you to be yourself. There's going to be kind of a conversational vibe to it. But what conversational doesn't mean is that it's like a 50-50 social conversation where you ask them questions and they ask you questions. From a flow perspective, pleasantries in the beginning, them asking you questions for the majority of the process or time together. And then at the end, they'll give you the opportunity to ask them questions. And that's where you should have some interesting questions prepared, questions that you shouldn't already know the answer to, ideally, questions that you shouldn't be able to just identify or find on the front page of the website, questions that connect the dots, questions that go a little bit deeper, ideally, or personalize things, not in a weird way. But if it's a student, you could ask them certain questions perhaps about their experience. I think I tell people also to mind the preface to their questions. Think about the preface to their questions. Are you going to maybe one way to connect the dots is to reference another conversation you had with a current student or an event you attended, and then have a follow-up question on that. So have those questions prepared, interesting questions, dot connecting questions for the end of the interview. As far as how many questions to ask at the end of the interview, I think you got to kind of read the room and you got to read the clock relative to how much time was blocked on your calendar. I like for people to think about starting with 2 questions and then permissioning the third. So ask a question, let them answer. Ask a question, let them answer. Don't ask both at the same time. Ask one, let them answer. Ask another, let them answer. And then maybe it's something like, do we have time for one more question? Now, again, if the conversation is very naturally flowing and it's with an alum and it's an off hour or something, don't cut things short artificially. If they're enjoying talking about it, you just want to be cognizant. You have to have your social antenna up. Look at the clock. Don't be afraid to say, are we doing okay on time? I want to be respectful of your time. But that's how I really kind of just covered it there. Questions for the end. We're going to get into these topics. Core questions. So the core, long awaited. Sorry for the big lead up. If you were here for the core questions, but the core 5, I'm going to say there are 4 buckets listed on here, but that I'm going to call the orange highlight a 5th. The core questions. Tell me about yourself. What are your short and long-term career goals? Why MBA? Why now? Why our program? And how can you uniquely contribute, or what specific contributions do you believe you can make to the program? Tell me about yourself. Right? We won't be able to walk through every little nitty-gritty detail of each of these. But with tell me about yourself, I think the big bucket or trap, the big bucket that people step in, trap people fall in, is speaking for too long on a question like that. So tell me about yourself. By the way, it could be worded as walk me through your resume. Well, even if it's walk me through your resume, that does not mean to walk somebody through every single line or every single bullet on your resume. This is probably a 2-minute answer, 2.5. We've done mock interviews where you ask that question and the person answers with an 8 or 10-minute response. You actually have to kind of cut them off. That's not what we want here. Target something like 2.5 minutes, maybe on the high end 3. Think about a way that you can organize your answer. Let's just say, for example, you had 2 jobs before applying to the MBA program. You might think about what I refer to as a lead-in. That would be, where are you from? Where did you go to college? What did you study? Why did you study what you've studied? That's your lead-in. How did you end up at job number 1? What does your company do? What do you do? 1 or 2 key highlights. Transition to job number 2. Why the transition? What does that company do if it's not self-explanatory? What do you do? 1 or 2 highlights. And then into an outro, which would be outside of work. So if the intro was kind of where you grew up, where you went to college, what you studied, why you studied it, that's the intro. Job number 1, job number 2, think about the transition into each. What does your company do? What do you do? 1 or 2 highlights into the next one. The outro would be outside of work or kind of an extracurricular passions, things you did. It could be during college or outside of work life. There's no it doesn't have to be that way. That's just one way. The key message is to think about a way to organize the answer so that you give yourself a little bit of discipline around what you're going to cover and how you're going to make sure it keeps moving, hitting interesting tee up kind of points without going into too much detail. Think of it like the movie trailer of what's to come or what you hope might come over the course of the rest of the interview. So that's just one potential way. Intro, job number 1, job number 2, outro. You could almost think of those as 4 little categories or pillars or talking points as well. But a few different ways to attack that. And if you look around online, you'll see a few different styles that people take with that. But that's one, just to think about. And again, avoid the trap of talking for too long. This is the movie trailer of what's to come. What are your short and long-term career goals? Think about here A lot of times I say here, maybe think about 3 parts. You want to, a lot of times you'll have answered this question within an application as well. In Kellogg, you'll have answered it in short answer form, for example, with those little tweet-sized bubbles that you had to fill in the application box. But, be specific here. We want to make sure that again, they've only seen your resume. They haven't seen your application. You should articulate things that are consistent with what you put in your application. The 3 parts that I often think about being included here are, what are literally your short-term goals? What are literally your long-term goals? And why are these goals your goals? Doesn't have to be in exactly that order. Some people might lead with the passion. There might be a build-up there. You can see a bullet point there that says, briefly prefaced with a thus far. I mean, doesn't have to do that. But if there's something from your life or experiences to this point that are the genesis or have motivated you toward those goals, that belongs in here. It could come at the beginning. It could come after you say what the goals are. It doesn't have to be short and long either. I mean, there could be a medium term. Well, short and long should be in there, but there could also be a medium term goal or a bridge. You could kind of articulate the trajectory of your goals, if you will. But just always, I think, keep in mind, what are the short? Be literal. Be clear about it. I should say this too. Maybe shouldn't make assumptions. I was going to kind of assume that you had really specific goals in your application, which you should. But if you didn't, when you talk about short-term goals, you should be articulating specific roles on specific teams at specific companies. And you should probably have researched in advance, do those companies recruit at Kellogg or Haas or wherever you're applying? Ideally, they should, probably should have, or you should have done your homework on that at least. If you've spoken with club members at those schools, odds are you'd have an understanding of which companies do recruit for which roles in the industries you're seeking. Specificity is super important. And if you did, by the way, have some of those conversations, here could even be, or maybe you save it for the why Kellogg or why Haas response. But if the companies you're interested in are active recruiters at your school and you validated that or uncovered that through research, through conversations, there's probably somewhere in here that you could weave that reference in. I spoke to, the co-president of the tech club, say his or her name or say their name. Especially if it's a student, they might know who they are. They told me all about how, such and such company, this might belong in like a why Kellogg or why Haas response, but don't be afraid to make those weave-ins if you've had relevant conversations. But do be specific with your goals. Please be specific with your goals, and please share the passion and purpose behind them. Again, short-term goals, what are they? Long-term goals, what are they? And why are these goals your goals? The passion and purpose behind them. What are you looking to accomplish? And what are the goals within the goals? What impact do you hope to have? Why MBA and why now? Here, I would think to yourself, and this is again something that is very inherent just to the whole application process and a lot of goals essays for schools, you have to do them. Haas and Kellogg a little bit different with the essays, but if you've done like a Wharton #1 kind of essay or like an LBS #1, a classic kind of like, what are your goals? Why MBA? Why our school? The logic that you've developed for those is going to be applicable really for a lot of these core questions. That's what we're tackling here. So think about it this way. If your goals are what you've said they are, well, I've already got, if my goals are my goals, I've already got perhaps knowledge, skills, and experience, A, B, C, D, which are relevant, which give me a foundation to these goals. But I'm missing, in order to achieve these goals, I'm missing E, F, G, H. Doesn't have to be 4. This is a little bit of weird alphabet soup, I realize, and it makes it a little bit algebraic. It's not meant to make it overly structured, but but maybe a little bit it is, because I want to compel or imbue the importance of being specific. So think, if your goals are what they are, what knowledge, skill, experience do you already have that are relevant? I would even say that But as a preface or as an opening to kind of answering why MBA, think about what knowledge, skill, experience you already have that are relevant. You've got a relevant foundation. Say that relatively briefly. I say to people sometimes to sentenceify it, meaning you're not like going into detail about A, B, C, D. You're sentenceifying it. You're probably going to just reference, because the question again is why MBA? It's not what skills you already have that are relevant. Sentenceify it. I've already got, I do believe as I look ahead to these goals, I do believe that I already have, some relevant knowledge, skills, and experience, for example, including blank, 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 and blank. But in order to achieve these goals, what are you missing? You've already got A, B, C, D. I'm missing E, F, G, H. What are those? Crystallize those. What are this is something, again, you probably should have ideally done during the essay drafting and essay writing process. And here now you're verbalizing it. I realize you might not have done it for Haas and Kellogg, but EFGH, crystallize those. What are you missing? What are those knowledge, skills, and experiences? And diversify those things. Diversify those buckets. Think about the totality of the MBA experience. Is some of it knowledge-based that you're missing? Is some of it hands-on experience-based? Is some of it leadership development-based or soft skill development-based? Is still another category related to community or network or recruiting opportunities or things like that? So diversify, crystallize, and be specific about your EFGH. And whereas you were sentenceifying the ABCD, here you're going to give a little bit of commentary about E, a little bit of commentary about F, a little bit of commentary about G, a little bit of commentary about H. If you do, it doesn't have to be 4 buckets, by the way, but that's just an example. So be specific with that, and again, diversify what those categories are. Think about what exactly are those gaps. EFGH are basically your gaps that stand between what you're doing now and getting and achieving your goals, getting where you want to go. So be specific, be thoughtful about those. Why our program? Why Kellogg? Again, a few different ways to slice this. There's no perfect way. One way is to take the EFGH categories that you just thought about or just articulated if the preceding question was why MBA, and articulate now how exactly Kellogg, in this example, gives you E, how exactly Kellogg gives you F, how exactly Kellogg gives you G, how exactly Kellogg gives you H. Again, it's not meant so that your articulation of this is overly structured or robotic, but it's there. That EFGH framework is there to kind of compel crystallization, thoughtfulness, and specificity within this answer. Always a challenge, by the way, to balance being specific with being concise. I realize that, easier said than done. But that's one way, is to carry those EFGH categories forward. If the EFGH categories were thoughtful enough and diverse enough, if they spoke to different parts of the MBA experience, then you should pretty naturally be able to verbally fill in or verbally articulate forward how Kellogg how Kellogg fills each of those buckets. Whether you adopt that approach or take a different kind of approach. I've seen also, people talk about the resources on one hand and the culture and community of the school on another. No matter how you do it, you absolutely make sure that in this answer, make sure you're being specific, but make sure that you're not just being specific about resources. You should know the resources of the school and paths you go and a few different things you can reference that are hyper relevant to your goals and your why MBA needs. But if you walked away from a why Kellogg answer, only mentioning a couple of courses and maybe an experiential learning resource, that's too limited. Think about the culture, the values, the people. How does that resonate with you? Why do you fit with that? We want to make sure, I think sometimes, and maybe even in the past, or maybe even just the way it's written on this page, if not verbalized or not reiterated by me, I would hate for somebody to see this on a page and just say, oh, I need to, mention a bunch of classes and experiential learning things. No, we need to feel you with this answer also. Feel that fit. Feel that you understand what Kellogg stands for, its culture, its values, its people. Infuse there should be resources in there as well, but we want to, the community, the people, in what ways are those things what ways do you fit with, or how does that resonate with you? And in what ways are they I guess you could say, the engines through which you would transform? Think too, now it's in orange here. Some schools, you'll see it as a separate question, the fifth of the core five. Some schools, you'll hear it as a separate question. Other schools, you got to be a little bit thoughtful about this. What unique contributions can you make to the program? Think about that. You don't want to walk away from this interview feeling like you're only taking from the school. So either you got to kind of strategize about this, either during your why Kellogg answer, or if you think it's going to come as a separate question, or maybe if you get a question, as is not uncommon with some of these interviews, a question toward the end of the interview, like, is there anything else you'd like to share, or anything else we haven't covered that you'd like to cover? Think about where and how you can articulate what unique contributions you can make to the program as well. And with that, I will say, it's more than just, this is true if you went through the essay writing process, or our applicants we work with hear it from us ad nauseum. It's not just, I'm going to join such and such a club, or I'm going to participate in such and such a conference. No, we want to know the contributions, the specific, thoughtful, introspective, deep contributions. Think about, are there like two, maybe? So it's not just, I'm going to join a club. It would be like, what role would you have? And even more than that, what would you actually do or add, uniquely do or add to that club? And have you spoken maybe to one or two people in that club already, and that got your mind turning around what the club does now and what you could potentially add, how you could potentially draw upon your own unique skills, your own unique background and experience to bring something new to the classroom, to your learning team, to your study group, to your cluster, to your cohort, to one of these clubs, to one of these conferences? Is there something brand new that you conceive or envision starting? So be really thoughtful and specific about what you would give to the program as well. And now you got to be, again, a little bit strategic. This is something we'd cover in greater detail during an interview prep session. For a given school, some schools have a propensity to ask, how will you uniquely contribute, or what will your legacy be, or questions like that. So you'll have a clear, you'll be able to think to yourself before the interview, okay, there's like an 80% chance I'm going to get that question, and that's where I'll answer it. If you have situations where the school does not seem to ask that question as explicitly about your contributions, you have to strategize around where and how that's going to show up. Maybe it is within your why Kellogg or why Haas answer, but you got to think then, how do I structure and how do I deliver it in a way that's not overly long? Love to go into it, but I'd love to go into it more here. But I think it's something that would be kind of person specific and school specifics. Something we cover. But that's the core. That's the core five. Tell me about yourself, or walk me through your resume. What are your short and long-term career goals? Why MBA? Why now? Why our program? And how would you uniquely contribute to our program? Not always worded in exactly those ways. By the way, not always asked in exactly that order. Sometimes fused, in fact. We'll see in a few minutes. Haas, if I'm just kind of looking at patterns out there in interview reports, I think I see Haas with maybe a little bit more of a tendency to merge the goal of the why MBA, why Haas question. So why MBA, why Haas? You'll see that with some frequency. Kellogg, I would say if you look at interview reports, you see them separated for the most part, but not always. I mean, it depends on the interviewer. It depends on the moment. Be ready for some of those to be merged. Probably most commonly why MBA, why our school would get merged. Then you got to think about, how do I synthesize? You don't want to then give two giant separate answers, because you got to be nimble about that. You got to hear the question. There are other schools that might just ask about your immediate post-MBA goals. So always listen to the question, listen to the exact question, and be nimble. You have your blueprint, build your blueprint in your head about how you'd approach the core five, but then be nimble about how would I actually maneuver verbally maneuver that I feel like that has negative connotations, but like as if you're like trying to manipulate the interviewer or something. No, but I just mean to be nimble. Be nimble in your answers. Be flexible. Have your blueprint for the 5, but be flexible. Be ready depending on how exactly the questions are worded, and know how you're going to kind of merge and synthesize if you need to merge any questions. Behavioral questions, another big bucket. Tell me about a time when. Share an example of. You'll see some schools lean harder into behavioral questions, others lean a little bit less. I think for Haas and Kellogg, you should expect 2 to 4 of these, a little bit just to throw a number out there, small handful, some might say. But these are example driven. I know even when I first encountered the word behavioral questions, back when I was going through the MBA application process, I said, well, what does that mean, behavioral questions? It's an example driven. They're example driven questions. Tell me about a time when. Share an example of. So here, some thoughts, some approaches. The first thing I would say is, well, again, research the schools. Look up the interview reports. You'll start to see some patterns and patterning and some tendencies toward different types of behavioral questions that are specific to each school. So you can have a little bit of that in your head. Next, build a mental bench of examples. Think to yourself, the experiences I've had in my life and career, which of those would be well suited to answer behavioral questions in an interview? Tell me about a time you led a team. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time you overcame a challenge. Tell me about a time you influenced a group or persuaded a group of people. I mean, there's a whole host of them. Again, if you look at the specific interview reports, you will see tendencies and patterns. We'll pull those up in just a couple of minutes for Haas and Kellogg. See if we can put our finger on any pulses there. But build that bench of examples in your head. You want it to be a somewhat diverse bench, meaning you don't want to just, if you get 4 behavioral questions, ideally you wouldn't be answering with something from work every single time. I think that could get a little bit, I think the interviewer is probably going to turn off if that's the case. So choose your examples wisely. Have that kind of flexible bench, diverse bench of examples. I say flexible, by the way, because you don't have to necessarily think of an example for every single possible behavioral question that's out there. Some of the examples you have could probably be used to answer different behavioral questions. I mean, if you just like a simple example of that would be, tell me about a time you failed. Well, if after that failure you overcame and ended up kind of getting it right or righting the ship the next time, that could be a overcame a challenge question. You overcame. So it just, maybe not the cleanest example, but there are examples out there you will have that can be deployed for different purposes. So that's what I mean by flexible bench of examples. Use the SCARL framework. They're listed at the bottom of the page. So you'll hear often, I think the acronym most associated with behavioral questions is the STAR method: situation, task, action, result. I have a little bit of a different spin on it of my own making here. I call it the SCARL method. I used to put it on the page as just SCARL. I've evolved that a little bit over the years, but let's take a look at that. So MIT, which has behavioral-oriented interviews, I think they used to call them behavioral event-based interviews, not exclusively behavioral interviews, but they had a page on their website. I don't think it's there anymore. But it said every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So think about that. When you build that mental bench of examples in your head, think about what is, if I had to verbally articulate this, you could practice with your friends, you could sign up for interview prep. If I had to verbally articulate these responses in, again, that 2-ish minute time frame, but it's a little bit as an aside, trap people fall in here again is talking. I know, by the way, I say this and I'm here talking for probably an hour and a half, just talking is what it's going to end up being. But so I apologize for that here. I'm telling you, keep things to 2 or 3 minutes. But yeah, you want to keep, you don't want to fall in the trap with your behavioral responses of just talking forever. So think about what is the beginning, the middle, and the end of my stories, of these examples, of these bite-sized examples that I'm sharing to answer whatever behavioral questions I encounter. The beginning, I would think about as the S and the C, the situation and the challenges. Set the stage, the who, what, when, where. 2 years ago at such and such company, I was assigned to a team that was responsible for blank. Now I know the interviewer who never met you before. Now they know the situation. What were the challenges? So beginning, situation, challenges. The middle, actions. I listed here 3 times intentionally. Actions, actions, actions. The reason for that, it doesn't have to be 3 steps. It's just there to remind you, don't gloss over the actions. We really want to hear how you did what you did. You got to, again, keep it specific but concise at the same time. Don't gloss over the how. Don't make it sound like you just waved a magic wand and everything got solved. First, I did this. Then we did this. Then we did this. Think about the actions. Unpack those actions. That's the middle of the story. The end of the story, results and lessons. Results is in there in parentheses. That's on purpose. Historically, in the STAR method or the SAR method, things end with results. I almost think the result, say the result. You should say the result. We need to know how things ended. But I think what's more interesting and insightful for an MBA interview is to share insights, lessons, reflections. Looking back, one thing I think we could have done better is blank. Looking ahead, or maybe next time, how you applied it. So think about that. L for lessons is in there very importantly, and I think is even the more interesting component of the end of the story. So situation, challenges, beginning, actions, 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 middle, results, lessons, end. Behavioral questions. There is a framework. Build your mental bench of examples. Draw from a mix of professional, personal, and community. Choose your examples wisely. Make sure you're thinking about the underlying value of each of them. And then use the SCARL framework in responding to them. By the way, too, you could, as you think about this, if you're, old-fashioned, I guess they would call it now, and write things in a notebook or on paper, or even just digitally, you could grid out a page. I used to say to people, hey, take a blank piece of paper, fold it in 4s. On one side, you're going to have 4 quadrants now on each side, and you could have 8 capsulized stories that you brainstorm. And in the 10 days leading up to your interview, keep that in your pocket. And when you're eating lunch or something, pull it out and look it over a little bit. You'll think about those different capsules. You might say to yourself, hey, you know what? That story's not as have your beginning, middle, and end, your SC, your AAA, your RL mapped out in those capsules. And you could constantly reflect on those. Self-awareness questions. This is a label of my own variety, of my own making. It's not something I don't think you'd hear out elsewhere. But these are questions like, how would you, what role do you typically play in a team? What is your leadership style? What are your main strengths? What are your main weaknesses? What would your colleagues say about you? Those are probably even the main 5 that people run into within this category, if you can call it that. What is your leadership style? What role do you typically play in a team? What are your main strengths? What are your weaknesses or areas for improvement? And what would your blank say about you? Your colleagues, your peers, your bosses. Sometimes you might get something like, what qualities do you think are most important in a leader? Or, who's a leader you admire most? I guess those aren't necessarily self-awareness, but they're cousin. Those are what you could call cousin questions to what is your leadership style. With these, I often say to people, brand it, elaborate on it, and then consider a mini example. You won't be able to apply this framework perfectly in every situation, nor do I think that if you had to give 3 strengths, I don't think you'd have probably verbal bandwidth or time to give a mini example for each of the 3 strengths. But what I mean by that is to label it. If they say, what is your leadership style? Brand it. Put some sort of description. Open your answer with some sort of clear-cut description or adjectives about what that leadership style is. We don't want, so brand it up front. That helps you answer the question directly and immediately and avoid the risk, as we see sometimes, of you burying the lead, of never really quite putting a stamp on what your leadership style is. So brand it. Same thing with the strength. I mean, they say, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Brand it. Say what the strengths are. Say what the weaknesses are. If they say, what role you typically play in a team? Brand it. So brand it first, then elaborate on it. What do you mean by, what do you mean by that? So here's what I mean by that, whatever adjectives you just used. You can elaborate a little bit on them. And then sometimes I say offer a mini example to support or illustrate. If you're talking about your leadership style, you've branded it, you've said what that leadership style is, you've elaborated on it, you've just put a little more context or explanation as to what you mean by that style or how it arose or whatever. Now put a mini, you could, if time permitting, add a mini example to that. I say mini example because it's not a behavioral question where the whole answer is an example. You got to be mindful of the clock and the duration of your response, but you could kind of reference an example that illustrates what you explained beforehand. Again, there's many different ways to approach these. That's just one style to think about. Brand it, elaborate on it, and then consider a mini example. And it sort of works. That style can sort of be applied for many of the different types of questions you get in a section. Like section, by the way, it's not like they're going through different sections, but in terms of our own categorization and our own sectioning out of these, brand it, elaborate on it, consider a mini example. This, again, is for questions like, what is your leadership style? What role do you typically play in a team? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And, what would your colleagues say about you? How would your colleagues describe you? Kind of thing. With these, by the way, listen, again, always listen to the question, the specific of the question. With strengths and weaknesses, you have some interviewers who don't. Some interviewers will say, give me your 3 main strengths. Tell me about your 3 main strengths. They'll put a number on it. Or your 2 main strengths, or your main strength. Others will not specify. So you have to kind of listen to that. And I think from a preparation or brainstorming in advance standpoint, I would probably think about beforehand or map out in my mind on a piece of paper, whatever. If they ask me for 3, I think it would be rare to get more than 3, I think. But I would have my 3 main strengths mapped out. I'd have my 3 main weaknesses mapped out so that if I were asked for 3 of either of those, I would know where I want to go with them. But you should also hierarchy them a bit in your head. Meaning if they only ask 1, which one of they say main strength or main weakness, which one of those am I going to? If they ask for 2, which 2? So that's just a little bit of an aside there. We're going to pull up some question banks in a moment. Final slide here, if you will. Be confident, be positive, be yourself. This got a little bit messed up. There we go. Be confident, be positive, be yourself. Be confident, but not overconfident. Be positive. You try to make, you don't have to it's not a comedy routine. You're not trying to, be overly dramatic and, but let your energy come across. Don't be overly, but it's still a professional interview, but you want yourself to come across, your personality, your energy, to come through the screen as best you can. You can, again, sign up for interview prep at avantiprep.com. We've got a coupon code there, again, with which you can save 5%. You can read our verified client testimonials if you're interested in it. But we're not quite done yet. We're gonna go over. I don't think I actually need to stop sharing this. I think I can pull up questions just like this. Ooh, this might be a little tougher to see. Let's zoom in. Oh, that didn't come close to what we needed to do. All right, maybe even a little more. There we go. right, so what do we have here? This is a question bank of really my own making, based purely on publicly visible and publicly available interview reports, in this case for Kellogg and Haas. What we're going to do, and we'll just spend another few minutes on this, and then I guess we'll open it for questions after, is just go through some of the questions, some of the question patterning that we talked about. I think we probably covered most of this already. Behavioral, it might be a little bit more interesting. But core questions, again, this is not this is not how the schools organize or categorize these questions. It's how, from a preparation standpoint, I think about it, basically, or we think about it at Avanti Prep in terms of working with applicants on their interview prep. And I just think that it helps. Again, you walk into these interviews, or you walk into this interview prep process, and there's just so many different types of questions out there. How do I navigate this? How do I think about these? I think sometimes bucketing them out like this can help you gain a little bit of, it can just make things feel a little bit more actionable, a little bit more tangible in terms of your preparation. The core questions, we talked through those a few minutes ago. You can see them basically highlighted here in yellow. Walk me through your resume. You could see kind of alternate versions listed out. This is something, again, you could, if you started with a blank piece of paper and went through interview reports for each of these schools, you'd end up with something fairly similar to this. And as you do it, again, part of the charm of that is not just receiving it, it's actually building that question bank yourself, because in doing so, your brain is automatically thinking through, subconsciously thinking through, how would I approach, how would I deconstruct, how would I answer this? What are my talking points? Walk me through your resume, highlighted in yellow as one of the core questions. What are your short and long-term goals? Why MBA? Why now? Why Kellogg or why Haas? Obviously, you wouldn't get that. You wouldn't get why Kellogg and why Haas in the same question. How would you uniquely contribute to Kellogg or Haas? Those are the main, let's call those 5, the main in yellow. That is the core 5. We talked about how to approach those in some form a little bit earlier. Little tendencies or observations that exist within that are very Haas and Kellogg specific. Kellogg, I think you could be ready. I think we're seeing a little bit more, question about backup plan. Not always. I think, again, if you went through interview reports, I don't know, maybe it would be like 40% of the time. Might be something that they are curious about for certain applicants whose goals feel a little bit reachy or something like that. I'm totally just theorizing about that, but you will see this. I have seen this for Kellogg a little bit more of late. Obviously, there are some schools you all might have applied to that ask this in their app. Fuqua asks it in their goals statement, in their 100-word goals statement. They ask you to include alternate goals in their backup plan. But here for Kellogg, I have it highlighted in gray. You could use whatever color patterning you want. What is your backup plan if your short-term career goals don't work out? I've seen to an extent over the years something perhaps like, what is the biggest challenge you expect to face at Kellogg? With Haas down here, which of Haas's 4 defining principles most resonates with you and why? So I said it earlier, inhale the propaganda of every school, a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but the point is research the heck, know these schools inside and out. Haas's 4 defining principles are so central to what the school stands for and fit at the program. You should have a good feeling and have a response ready for this. Whether you get the question or not, who knows? But you should be familiar enough and kind of enmeshed enough in the 4 defining principles and all, and similar concepts for Kellogg, to be honest, when you talk about why Kellogg, but be ready just in case for a question that is oriented specifically toward them. In this case, which of those 4 defining principles resonates with you most and why? Self-awareness questions category. So this is actually a slightly different order than we looked at in the presentation, but self-awareness questions. I talked about what is your leadership style. I feel like with Kellogg, we're seeing that a good amount. I think if you went through the interview reports, you'd see a fairly high frequency with that. Just because you know it, you got to think. Then you got to think, brand it, elaborate on it. Mini example. What is your leadership style? There are cousin questions to that. I've said before, whether for Kellogg or other schools. You'll see different variations of this. Some of them are not quite self-awareness. They're more, I guess, leadership questions. What does leadership mean to you? What qualities make a good leader? Who is a leader you admire and why? I think for Tuck, I was seeing some of that. How has your leadership style evolved? What role do you typically play in a team? That's a question I used to see a ton for Kellogg. I don't know that I've seen it quite as much in the more recent ones, but it's still it's enough of a common MBA self-awareness question that I would just be ready for it. What is your leadership style? What role do you typically play in a team? i.e. when you're not the leader. And I would probably caution against saying I'm always the leader. You wouldn't want to say what role do you typically play in a team? Well, I'm always the leader. No, you don't want to do that. That's probably a red flag. But think about what role you typically play in a team. We talked about some of these. What are your main strengths? What are your main weaknesses? I noted a few minutes ago, listen to the question. Are they asking for one? Are they asking for two? Are they asking for three? Do they not specify? If they don't specify, how many are you going to offer? Is it 3 strengths, 2 weaknesses? What you think about that? How would blank describe you? How would your colleagues or friends describe you? I think it would be pretty rare to receive a question like that where they ask, how would your colleagues describe you? And then how your friends would describe you. I think usually you could think about it as one question and have some preparation around or some proactive thought around what themes you want to hit with that, and then deploy those themes sort of regardless of who, you maybe have to be a little bit nimble if they do end up asking, say, okay, well, then how would your friends think about it? But hey, if you're consistent at work and in person, it might be similar things, but just be ready for that. Kellogg, I'm seeing a decent bit of what is the weakest part of your application. Again, that still might not be like the majority of instances, but it's a pattern you might observe as you go through. So that's specific to your application. It's not a weakness. Well, it could overlap with some of the weaknesses you have in other regards, but it's more specific to your application. I think I haven't really seen what is the strongest part of your application, but I would be ready for it. Why not? If you're thinking about the weakest part, why not just think a little bit in advance of what the strongest part would be? If I had to synthesize again for self-awareness questions, what is your leadership style? What role do you typically play in a team? Strengths, weaknesses, what would your colleagues or friends or bosses or whoever say about you? Probably kind of a core 5 if in there with some patterns. Again, if you look at the interview reports, I think you're going to see a lot more. What is your leadership style showing up for Kellogg of late? What is the weakest part of your application? Not one of the ones it's not one of those main ones. Not the regular weaknesses question is a little bit of a different application specific take on it. Behavioral questions. This is where you probably see the most variance, or the most like school to school variance. I've got ones that I observe a little bit more for Kellogg here in yellow, and ones I observe a little bit more for Haas in blue. Again, all of this based purely on just listening to applicants who have interviewed with the school, reading interview reports, and just pouring myself into all kind of publicly available resources that you would be able to pick up on just the same. I think it's just how much time do you spend doing that in advance of your interview. But if you want to pick up on patterns like that, I think you'll be able to see them, not with perfect predictability at all, but patterns and relative frequencies and such. Tell me about, for Kellogg, tell me about a greatest accomplishment. Whether this is a behavioral question or not, I mean, you could say that it's kind of a resume probe, I guess, as well. But you could think about, what example would I share? You got to listen. Again, listen to the question. Sometimes you'll see, tell me about your greatest accomplishment at work. Sometimes it's unspecified. Sometimes they'll say outside of work. So you do have to be a little bit nimble on that. Probably think of multiple in advance. Tell me about a time you worked in a diverse team. That's a big one. I think a big one we see a decent bit of pattern wise for a lot of schools, Kellogg in particular. tell me about a time you worked in a diverse team. You sometimes might hear verbally articulated as part of the question, what challenges did you face and what did you learn? Or what was most challenging and rewarding about the experience? But not always. Even if they don't ask what was challenging and what did you learn, you should be answering with the SCARL approach. So you should always include what the challenges were, what actions you took to overcome them, and what you learned. So even if what was challenging and what did you learn is not asked by the interviewer as part of this question or any other, they're basically asking it. Like if they say, tell me about a time you failed, you should be sharing what the challenges were, why you failed, and what you learned. Situation, challenges, actions, like what happened, results, and lessons. So always assume what challenges did you face and what did you learn is kind of there as part of the question. Haas, I think you'll see some tendency toward a diversity question as well in the behavioral category. A nuance between these is on the Kellogg side, I see more of a worked in a diverse team. On the Haas side, I see more of a fostering diversity or fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion in a professional setting, in a non-professional setting. You might get an outright question too about like, what is your experience with diversity, equity, and inclusion? But, definitely categorically questions around diversity, whether it's working in diverse teams, maybe lean a little bit more on the Kellogg side, or fostering diversity, promoting diversity, equity, inclusion on the Haas side. Be ready for those. And you'll see, again, I have kind of main versions that I observe highlighted here, and then what I call cousin questions below it. They're similar questions that deal with the same topic, but are worded a little bit differently. If you build out your own kind of framework here, you might, adopt a similar approach or do what works for you. Kellogg, again, Kellogg in yellow, Haas in blue here. Not like it's not written in stone, but just observationally and from a tendency perspective. Tell me about a time you stepped into a leadership role. I think with any MBA interview, you should be ready to talk about your leadership style. You should be ready to talk about what you think makes a good leader or make a good team. And you should be able to share an example of when you led a behavioral question example. Tell me about a time you led a team. Added nuance here for Kellogg. If we're really reading closely, a lot of times you'll see stepped into a leadership role. Does that imply maybe you kind of stepped into it, you were a little more proactive in seizing it? Probably doesn't change. I talked about flexible bench of examples earlier. It's still your leadership example. There's probably just a little bit of framing in the beginning to make sure that you're saying, you stepped into it. What drove you to seize, to grab those reins, or why did you step into? The more straightforward version of that would just be, tell me about a time you led a team. A little bit of nuance difference here is, tell me about a time you stepped into a leadership role. Haas, tell me about a time you led without formal authority. So it's a leadership question as well, but there's a different nuance. They're asking you to tell about a time you led without formal or explicit authority. Tell me about a time you failed. That's a question you should be ready for any MBA interview. I guess I see it a little bit more for Kellogg. Again, in parentheses here, what did you learn? Well, it doesn't matter if they ask that. You should include that as part of their answer. Tell me about a time you failed. Go through the story. What were the challenges? What happened? What was the situation of the challenges? What happened? What was the result? What did you learn? How did you apply it next time? Tell me about a time you showed resilience or overcame an obstacle. This is kind of an overcoming a challenge question. Again, one that whether we were looking at Kellogg and Haas or just looking at MBA interviews more broadly, that grid, if you do that 4-quadrant thing on the front and the back and you're trying to capsulize examples, behavioral questions for MBA interviews, tell me about a time you overcame an obstacle or overcame a challenge is worth being ready for. Tell me about a time you received constructive feedback. Haas, tell me about a time your team disagreed, then built consensus and what your role was in this. Or tell me about a time you managed conflict on a team with different perspectives. There's sort of a conflict management question, perhaps related to differing perspectives. This stuff varies, by the way, year to year. So, what you read, this is, again, all of this is from publicly available interview reports on GMAT Club. Elsewhere, you could look around. You'll be able to put your finger on the pulse of different questions. They're going to vary, though, from year to year. But I think if you looked around, you'd probably see some centering for Haas around. We saw earlier the question about fostering diversity, or DEI. Your experience with DEI, probably a little bit more around fostering or promoting it. Leading without formal authority, something around disagreement or team conflict, and your role in helping resolve that or build consensus. Risk, what's the biggest risk you've taken? Tell me about a time you took a risk. For Haas, again, just to summarize, diversity, teamwork. We've seen some questions about humility, leading a difficult team. That's kind of the conflict resolution one. Risk-taking, we just mentioned. Bringing up team morale, that could be one kind of in the same orbit as the team was in conflict and you had to kind of build consensus, help unify, build up morale. What role did you play in that? Again, do your homework, because it's, rather than hearing it from me on some video, you go around and really grapple with what the school stands for, the values that are specific to it for any school, and the interview reports that are publicly available. And you'll be able to kind of think through. It's not so that you know exactly which questions you're going to get. And it's not so that you can pre-program exactly how you're going to answer them. It's so that you go through this introspective process to understand and think about where you would lean and which stories you'd share and what themes you want to make sure come across. A final category here, miscellaneous or closing. What do you do outside of work? I'd always be ready to talk about your hobbies and interests. You probably will have mentioned some of these, I think, in the opening. Tell me about yourself. But if you had to click into them or focus more specifically, just think about, how do I structure that answer? Where do I focus? What's interesting? What's unique? What's revealing about who I am? Some schools, probably both of these, not guaranteed, but a lot of schools out there ask a kind of a penultimate question before they pass it to you to ask them questions. Is there anything else you wish I would have asked, or anything else you'd like to share? I consider it a couple different strategies here. I consider it first maybe a safety valve question or an escape valve. If there's something you forgot to share, if you wanted to talk about how you would uniquely contribute to the program, but didn't have the opportunity to do so, here's an opportunity to do that. If there's something you omitted, you talked about why Kellogg, you were like, oh shoot, I meant to talk about blank, and you for whatever reason omitted that. Here's an opportunity. I think with the contributions thing, it's a nice safety valve for that. If you've already covered everything that you hoped to cover, well then consider what additive remark or even closing remark you could, or reiterative remark or authentic remark you could add here. I think what we don't want to do here is just have you say, no, that's it. I think we covered everything. That's a missed opportunity. It sounds thoughtless. So think, if you do get a question like this, it often is like the last question they ask you. Is there anything else you wish I would have asked that you'd like to share? Is there anything else you'd like to tell me? Is there anything else I should know? Use it as a safety valve. If there's something you really would be value add, maybe it's related to contributions, unique contributions you could make. You could click into that answer if you haven't had the opportunity to cover it earlier. Or you could, if you did cover everything, you could use this just for kind of a closing remark, something that reiterates fit for reasons you described earlier, maybe something new to add. So don't waste the opportunity or give a flat response like, no, I think we covered everything. Thank you. And then, do you have any questions for me? We talked about questions toward the beginning of this conversation. If you need to rewind back, and I don't know if it was about like the 20-minute mark or so, if anyone's watching this in the future. We talked about how to approach that. One last thing here I skipped over in the very beginning, at least the beginning of my document, probably more toward the beginning of an interview, resume probing. So a first common question might be, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. Then it is, totally fair game for them to, and you don't see like a ton. I don't think Kellogg or Haas are known for like really bombarding you with probes about things on your resume. You never know, you could get a certain interviewer who is. Otherwise, for Kellogg, maybe, it might be like 2 questions. Maybe what is your most significant accomplishment at work, which I had under the behavioral header. Something that could come here. What was your most memorable contribution during undergrad? Most memorable contribution at work? Tell me a little bit more about this project. Tell me more about that hobby. Why did you choose your undergraduate university? Why did you choose your major? Some of these probes, the old saying is to be ready to talk about any word or phrase or sentence or bullet on your resume. So be ready for probing, be ready to click into those things. Some things, by the way, about like why you chose certain jobs, companies, motivations behind key decisions or transitions along the way. Some of those might be nice rather than receiving them as probes. Some of those are probably nice to include in your opening movie trailer, walk me through your resume statement. I don't know if you could get every, you might not have enough verbal bandwidth within a 2 or 2.5 minute opening remark to get every transition in there, but it's something to think about. What led you? I was talking about the lead into each job, or why maybe during college, why you chose your university and or major, but why then, how did you end up in, or what interested you about each job? Think about those transitions into each. So that is everything I was hoping to cover here. I know it's a long conversation, but hopefully helpful for those of you who are like really getting deep into interview prep. Probably speaking the same language now here with it. If you only have like a toe in the water so far, it probably feels like a lot of information. You're like, whoa, wait a second, where do I start here? But as you dig in and as you begin to get into the interview prep mindset, I think that this will feel really relevant and hopefully was helpful here today. Got the coupon code back up on the screen. I thank everybody for their time. If there are questions, I think I'm supposed to look through here and see if we got so we have some questions that are not related to the interview. We have a question about reapplicants. Can you give some advice for questions for reapplicants? That's a good question. Not applicable, of course, to everybody. Most reapplicants, you will have had to submit a reapplicant essay of 250 to 500 words, depending on the school. Advice for reapplicants, it would just be ready for, as it relates to interview prep specifically, be ready for a question about being a reapplicant. How has your application changed since last year? What way has your candidacy improved or changed since last year? It's probably something you can take back, think back to your reapplicant essay, because hopefully that, if it was done well or thoughtfully, and specifically your reapplicant essay should have multiple parts within it that speak to different ways. Maybe you improved your GMAT score. Maybe you got promoted at work. Maybe you took on leadership responsibilities outside of work. Maybe your goals, you revised your goals, and maybe you engaged with the school on a greater, it's usually a multi-pronged. Usually there are multiple categories to that. Ideally, in your reapplicant essay, you should have delved into a few of those buckets. Not everyone's going to have every one of those buckets, but just be ready to verbalize that and bring it to life. And if some of it is related to your engagement with the school or the greater specificity of your goals, think about, how you can weave in, if it's related to the school, weave in some of these touch points you've had with the school, the steps you've taken to advance your understanding of the school, advance your engagement with the school, advance the steps toward your goals. Think about, but don't only do that. Think about what all of the areas or buckets of improvement are. I think that's one of the only questions we have related specifically to interviews here. We have, a question, for example, about Haas social impact. With anything, whether it's social impact or consulting or energy or management consulting, whatever the case may be, technology, get to know these programs and their specific resources and specific value propositions related to each of those fields. Think about location, think about courses, clubs, extracurriculars, conferences, case competitions, locations, treks, internship opportunities, career resources, the schools network, the recruiting apparatuses, all those different, that whole litany of things. I talked about the, why MBA and why Haas, why MBA, why Kellogg earlier. Those are some of the things that would infuse those answers. Those are some of those things that would infuse those answers. And don't ignore, of course, the culture, the community, the values, the fit of the school. You want to be able to talk very specifically about Haas or about Kellogg, about their resources, the courses, the clubs, the extracurriculars, the case competitions, the location benefits, all those things I just mentioned, but not exclusively. You also want to show and know about the culture, the community, the values of the school. We do have a final question in here. So yeah, again, I was looking at the next question, but just to reiterate that, know your schools, know the schools, know them inside and out, do your homework, talk to people, bring that to life, attend events, read blogs, go online, watch videos, know the resources and which exactly, like almost like your plan, what you would do, what you would benefit from, how you would contribute, but also, again, your fit, the culture, the community, the values of the school, how that resonates. We don't just want to hear the facts. We want to feel the fit. Last question here. What's the best way to tackle the "are you applying to other schools as well" question, especially if you aren't applying to other schools? Well, it's a tough question. I don't know that I really see this question a ton for either of these schools, but it's out there. Maybe Fuqua is a school I would associate this with. Well, first thing is to think about in the application, a lot of applications you've already answered or indicated where else you've applied. So, I'd probably be consistent with that. Now, if you haven't applied to other schools, I would be honest about that. That's an opportunity. If you've only applied to this one school, I would always be honest, by the way, but I'm just saying here that, it's not something what I meant by that is it's not something to kind of hide behind or balk at. If you truly haven't applied to other schools, and this is the only school to which you've applied, I think you could take the opportunity to say that and use it as an occasion to double down on why this particular program, why, you could say hot. That might even be something, by the way, that if you get a question later on, like, tell me, is there anything else you'd like to share? You might even seize that. Some schools would have even asked maybe for you to put that in an optional essay. Like if you talk to an AdCom before you apply, I've actually heard AdComs say that. Hey, if you're only applying to our school, let us know that in the optional essay. You could have a couple sentences about why that's the case. But that's a way for you to show deep interest and commitment to that school. And then a little bit of the rationale, I think in an interview setting, if you got that question or even proactively, and you only applied to that school, there's an opportunity for you to express that extra level of commitment, the rationale for it, the extra level of interest. Some people would say maybe there's a little bit, you're giving up maybe a little bit in the way of potential scholarship negotiations by showing your whole hand. But, if your priority here is to get in, I maybe wouldn't overthink that. I think it's an opportunity. So hope everybody enjoyed and benefited. I appreciate you marching through all the detail with me today. I think with something like this, I don't know that there's not a cursory way. If you really want to grapple with the details and the patterns and the question types and the nuances and how you tackle those for these kind of interviews, I think that, thinking about it, looking at questions, thinking through them. Some people could probably go in there and just let it rip, maybe, but I think most people would probably want to think about things in advance and tackle things in advance. So I appreciate everyone's time. and the opportunity to be together today. If you are interested in interview prep, avantiprep.com. You could sign up directly there, and there's a coupon code to save 5%. You save about $40 on things. So wish you the best of luck and hope that we can meet again in the future. Have a great day.